So as you can see from the map on the left, by the 1930s, that liberal democracy was declining in Europe, and that one type of authoritarian system or totalitarian system or another was on the rise. And if we look at the rhetoric coming from politicians, the media in these places, there's clearly a connection to the disillusionment with liberal democracy stemming from the pre-World War I and World War I era, in that many people and some political parties, governments that come to power, point the finger at liberal democracy as being, in their minds, from their point of view, the main cause or one of the main causes of the First World War, which is a bit strange, since it doesn't seem to me clear by any stretch that liberal democracy is the explanation or even an explanation for World War I. But in a broad sense, right, the capitalist element of the Enlightenment project was a pretty strong one. So they weren't entirely wrong, at least in seeing the advent of World War I stemming from certain features of liberal democracy. Although in the end, I still wouldn't consider that to be a major sort of explanatory, a cause with major explanatory value. So all kinds of irrational side effects and results of World War I. One of them is the move to, again, totalitarian government. Francisco Nitti, leader in Italy. I won't be talking about the Italian fascists, other than brief mention here or there for reasons of time. But he said, freedom. Many people smile at the word. Democracy, parliaments. There are few who do not speak ill of parliaments. And that was a pretty common theme, not just in Italy, but around Europe during the time period. He said that in 1927. Of course, liberal democracy still lived on in the UK, in France, and some other places, the Low Countries, but it was certainly on a decline during this period, and there's no doubt it had something to do with people's interpretation, however accurate and inaccurate, of the causes of World War I. Benito Mussolini, the man who would rise to power and become the fascist dictator of Italy in the 1920s, says to women, go back home, or the men, to tell the women, go back home and tell the women I need births, many births. So a traditional concept of women's role in society, to put it mildly here. Mark Mazauer, already quoted, saying, interwar ideology of motherhood had deep roots. The growing importance of conscript armies made the size and health of a country's population an issue of military and national security, especially as Europe's states seemed locked in a Darwinian struggle. The French were worried that Germany's faster population growth meant their own extinction as a great power. Some people even thought of it sort of more extremely than that, that if we, whoever we, was, the French, if we don't increase our birth rate and increase the population because of it, in the next big war, many were assuming there would be one, we might just go extinct. We might just not just lose, we might actually sort of all of us be killed. So it's quite irrational, of course, to think that way, but it's one of those sort of, so often happens in the world, that though it's irrational, we could kind of see how somebody might think that, given the the irrationality of the First World War. And to sort of add a little bit of a little bit to this, I would say this, that World War I had sort of a dementing effect on European society as a whole. It sort of twisted everything. Everything was like a car that had been an accident that's still running, but sort of barely, and parts and things are sort of hanging off in the wrong direction. World War I just twisted the European life, European culture, European worldview into all kinds of sort of grotesque and odd shapes. There was certainly an economic crisis in the post or interwar years, and that's even before the stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression, which of course made all that worse. One novelist of the period said, in retrospect, it was as if someone had picked up the world and shaken it into utter confusion. There were no permanent values. What were paper of diamonds? What were paper, diamonds, gold, houses or factories? A transient illusion, a fleeting gleam, a dissolving fantasy. Basically saying that even material gain sort of seemed pointless to many people, given their experience with Europe, World War I and thereafter. Mark Mazar once again claiming that after the Great War, Europe's economic life was in chaos. In Poland, 4 currencies were in use simultaneously. In starving Vienna, it had been turned into a giant city in a dwarf country, and streets were filled with refugees and hungry former imperial civil servants. Prices everywhere were hundreds or thousands of times higher than before the war. There were more than 2 million unemployed in Britain alone. This is before the Great Depression, so even in the 1920s, Europe wasn't in depression yet, but there certainly were signs of extreme ill health in certain places, in certain ways, economically, that is. In Germany, more specifically, the 1920s, as already mentioned, is the decade when Hitler and the Nazis did come to power. So it's not incorrect to think of the interwar period in Germany during what was known as the Weimar Republic, the German government at the time, which was Germany's first experiment ever in democracy, as being partly about the Nazi rise to power. But there were a lot of other things going on. And since this is a problem in German history altogether, I mean in the study of German history altogether, one German historian, an American whose expertise is Germany, has a particular pet peeve about all this, though he recognizes, of course, the significance of what the Nazis, Holocaust, did in a horrific way to the world. He does believe that what happens far too often, most of the time, certainly in popular culture, but even amongst scholars as well, is that everybody sort of looks back at Nazi Germany with, of course, the knowledge of hindsight. We know what happened, so we then tend to look back into the German past and look for signs of Nazism. And that's not illegitimate, because it's important to look for the causes, the origins, how did Germany develop to a point where it actually, became dominated by Hitler and the Nazi Party. Nonetheless, and again, I can see how this mistake would happen. It's given the immensity of World War II and the Holocaust and the unfathomable and ghastly, barbaric wreckage caused by Hitler and the Nazis. I can see how that would happen, but it tends to crowd out our view of everything else going on in the German past that wasn't leading to Nazism. And so that kind of gets swept aside. And also, what gets swept aside too from this, present vantage point, an anachronistic vantage point, looking, back at the past from what we already know happened, and that is the tendency to think that, or believe that it was all leading inexorably in that direction, that it was inevitably going to happen that way. And the scholar I've at least alluded to here, that this is a pet peeve of his, he tries to sort of deal with that in many of his books, showing that, well, there were plenty of other possibilities. It wasn't foreordained that the Nazi Party would come to power in Germany. For instance, there was a fairly strong strand of liberalism in Germany, with liberal kind of enlightenment values based on freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, etc., that could have, under different circumstances, been the dominant one. So we shouldn't just sort of telegraph everything with a view to assuming that all was leading towards Nazism. So the Weimar Republic is usually studied by looking at how it sort of set the table for Hitler and how Hitler sort of used it to come to power himself without recognizing, and there are a couple of good books that I think do more than just talk about the Nazis, that in Weimar culture, particularly Berlin, there was a lot of interesting things going on. Art, nightlife, various aspects of culture, jazz music. You can see in the picture, the cabarets were famous, even movies. So, and all that stuff was real. Especially early in the 1920s, the Nazis were barely a presence yet. Early in the decade, they were mainly a presence in Bavaria, one part of Germany, southeastern Germany, where Munich is, but hardly anyone even knew who they were in the rest of Germany. And there were other white right-wing fascists, extreme right-leaning groups, other than the Nazis, who had a presence in other cities, other parts of Germany, more so than the Nazis. So there was sort of an eerie, political feel to, and a dangerous, feel to Germany, because there were these right-wing and left-wing extreme groups and parties, but the country wasn't dominated by it yet. Now, by the end of the 1920s, now that's starting to change, as we'll see. But through much of the decade, the Nazis were sort of one element in sort of a crazy, decade. But in some ways, a decade that if you lived, say, in Berlin, in the 1920s, and you didn't know what was going to happen in the future, you wouldn't particularly be focusing on the Nazi side, unless you were a Nazi. You wouldn't be focusing on that. You'd be focusing on a lot of the things. Some of them, interesting, positive things. But the Weimar Republic, again, first time ever, the German people had a democratic government, and that's partially an explanation as to why this government had problems succeeding, didn't succeed in the end, is because it's quite possible Germans just weren't prepared for democracy, that they weren't ready for it. They had no experience with it. They're novices at democracy. I don't mean just the politicians, but even the public sort of being able to accept all the features of democracy. Because democracy has, we know this now, certainly downsides to it. And so without experience with it, it can look and could look to people as if this was failing. That being said, the Weimar Republic as a democracy had weaknesses anyway. So that it wasn't necessarily about democracy or Germans' perception of democracy. In some ways, it was just the performance of this particular democracy that was seen to be, falling short, and indeed it was in many ways. There were multiple parties. You can kind of see from the blurry slide there on the left. At the extreme left end of the political spectrum is the Communist Party. At the extreme right, as things shook out over the decade, is the Nazi Party. And in the middle, a number of other parties. Social Democrats is basically a socialist party, two center parties, and two kind of right-wing parties, but not extreme, sort of totalitarian Nazi/fascist right. But multi-party systems tend to dominate in Europe today, unlike the U.S., where there's a two-party system, Great Britain, where there's more or less a two-party system. So such democracies are a little more difficult to understand, at least for us. But the Weimar Republic wasn't a failure in every way, but it had plenty of challenges to overcome, which wasn't its own fault, but its own failings, and maybe its leaders' own failings, because democracy was new in the country, certainly are a major factor in explaining what ends up happening to the government and in what way. A good example of how ineffectual the Weimar Republic was in some ways, and it's true that it was, throughout much of the 20s, there was a low-level civil war going on between the Nazi and Communist parties, two of the parties in their multi-party democracy. And I mean that both sides had kind of a quasi-military or paramilitary force. The Nazis are famous for the brown shirts, or SA. We'll get back to them as well. But the Communist Party had kind of their own armed thugs as well. And they were at, in city after city, mainly in the big cities, actually having sort of street battles and street fights with each other. They hated each other. Far left party, far right party, ideologies are opposed to each other. Both of them were growing, so they were rivals in that sense as well. But there was actually, some small number overall, but there was actually, people killed and wounded in these kind of pitched battles that they're fighting with their own private armies. That's not good. If a government can't or will not put that down, it's a bad sign for the government's future as the government. So this is going on under the nose of Weimar Republic, and for whatever reason, it wasn't brought to a standstill. Remember that we said in the very first unit in this class that for governments to centralize effectively, they must have a monopoly of force. That's not a monopoly of force in any way. If you've got two political parties that are legal parties, they're perfectly legal, and have their own private armies fighting each other in your streets, you being the government, and you can't or don't put a stop to it, that's on you. As far as the leadership in the Weimar Republic is concerned, in many ways, they had gifted leaders. All three of these guys had their abilities, but they all made mistakes in one way or another. But the question, did the Weimar Republic have poor leadership? I think the answer to that is no. Given the challenges they were up against, I think overall they did a good job. Stresemann in the middle tried to handle the Treaty of Versailles in a very deft way, and you can say that he succeeded to some degree. He was trying to get out from under its most odious provisions, but didn't want to bring down the wrath of the Allies on Germany. So he tried to kind of steer a middle course, complying at times, not complying at others, saying one thing, doing something else, so as to kind of slow things down, water down Germany's responsibilities without abrogating them entirely. On the right, the Minister of Finance through the early part of the Republic, and you can see that he only lived until 1922, but he himself is a good example in his own person as to the challenges facing this government, whatever their leadership qualities, skills. Rathenau was assassinated by a right-wing group, not a Nazi group, but a kind of Nazi-like group in Berlin in 1922. On his way to work in the morning, he and his chauffeur were both gunned down by this sort of armed kind of terrorist group. And making it even more frightening then and now, why did they assassinate him? Well, they were anti-Weimar Republic. They thought it was sort of too, conservative or too middle of the road a government. This is an extreme right-wing party that was responsible, but he also happened to be, he was Jewish, and this wasn't an accident that they killed a Jewish, leading minister of the Weimar Republic. So this is a right-wing, extreme right-wing, like the Nazis, anti-Semitic right-wing group. It didn't help German stability and the Weimar Republic's own situation that they were strapped. They were the ones that had to pay the reparations payments decided on at Versailles. And this certainly was an economic problem. Germany, from one year to the next, and sometimes more than others, had a tough time paying these. But it was actually more of a political problem than it was an economic problem. Remember, all Germans despised the Treaty of Versailles. All of them. And so if you're the government, and this is where Stresemann is in a difficult spot. In some ways, he was doing a good job trying to, massage all of this, knowing that if he went too far in trying to oppose Britain and France enforcing the treaty, that they might get their country occupied or attacked, or stern measures taken against them, but also trying to again cut it down the middle. So he did, slowly, gradually try to back Germany away from the reparations payments and other, compromises the Germans were forced into at Versailles. But the public didn't see it that way. Anything less than just complete and utter, sort of standing fast against the Versailles Treaty was seen by many Germans as selling out, especially as the Nazis start to rise to power, and Hitler says, if we come to power, I'll just ignore the Versailles Treaty. I'll just crumple it up and throw the paper in the garbage, and the British and French can do whatever they want, and we'll deal with it as it comes. That's not what the Weimar Republic was saying. That's not what Stresemann was doing, but it might have been wise on Stresemann's part nonetheless. So the public was impatient with this type of subtle approach to dealing with reparations and other aspects of the treaty requirements. In the middle of the 20s, actually last for almost 1 year entirely, mostly the year of 1923, there was hyperinflation in Germany. Just the fact that we see a 50 million mark banknote here tells us something. This isn't a joke. These were in common usage for a number of months, maybe even only weeks, I forget, because the money was changing in value so quickly. But the money, inflation means, was becoming more and more hollowed out and losing its value, so that big bills didn't really mean much. I forget what 50 million marks, at least at this point, would translate into, but it wasn't much. And the inflation got so out of control, the German mark, their equivalent to our dollar, became so worthless and valueless that people were taking, like famously, wheelbarrows full of bills to the store to buy bread, and workers were getting paid and going out and cashing their checks, or just taking the cash, got paid by cash, and just spending it all that day, going to the supermarket, the stores, spending the whole thing. Why? Because they knew that by the next day it would be worth half that. So we might as well spend it all now, because if we save any of it, it's going to be worth about half as much tomorrow. And so there's just crazy things took place. For foreign investors, this was a bull market, to be sure, and this also caused consternation and anger on the part of Germans, as you would expect. So an American, a Brit, an Italian could come into Berlin or Cologne and buy like an entire city block for like $50, because the exchange rates were radically out of skew, or they were askew. So all of these things and many, many more caused not just an intense year of suffering economically and socially by Germans, but it did long-lasting damage even after the problem went away. And it was mainly caused by one German leader, the head of their national bank, who, much like our leader of the National Reserve today, has autonomy, a lot of sort of independent power, just kept making bad decision after bad decision, and there wasn't much the government could do, and until it finally sort of he corrected, but it was too late. At least for the long-term damage already done. So lots of long-term, long-lasting social psychological consequences to this. And then the stock market crash happens in October of 1929, and the Great Depression hit Germany subsequently extremely hard. Some historians are prone to saying that the Great Depression, which was a global depression, hit the United States and Germany hardest of all. And if that's so, there may be other countries that sort of qualify for top status here, but there's definitely a connection between the U.S. and Germany, the heavy suffering there, because the German government, the Weimar Republic, their economic system, which was, capitalist, was being propped up by the U.S. So it had never returned to a, state of health like it had, lived in before World War I. And so the government in the 20s, the economy in the 20s in Weimar Germany was being propped up by loans from American banks, a lot of credit coming there. And of course, when the crash happened in 29, those American banks just started, making margin calls, and the liquidity dried up, the loans dried up. So Germany now is left, without cash, without the ability to access credit to make ends meet. And so this is part of the reason for the extra suffering that Germany suffered in the Depression. They were heavily reliant on the U.S., and it's, of course, New York City, Wall Street, the stock market, where this whole thing started. The United States is hit hard. Germany's then going to get hit hard. And it is, I think, the Great Depression, more than anything else, that set the table for Adolf Hitler. I don't mean to say that the Great Depression made it likely or for sure that he was going to come to power. It did not. But I think it is fair to say, as I do at the bottom of the screen, no Great Depression, no Hitler. Why? Because this was his window of opportunity, and he knew it. He saw it. Hitler was enthused by the Great Depression. He understood. He clearly saw, this is our chance. This is my chance. This is the window of opportunity. We've talked about windows of opportunity in history. Napoleon seeing his. Well, Hitler saw it here. Well, why would a depression, an economic downturn, offer Hitler an opportunity? Because Germans, who are already, again, angry about the Treaty of Versailles, now they're even more angry about it because they're suffering economically, and there's still reparations payments, and so it just makes their dislike of the treaty even more emotional. But Hitler realizes that it's going to be much easier now to convince Germans that Nazi ideas make sense. Or to say this another way, to put it in a broader perspective, I think it's accurate to say that in economic hard times, severe economic hard times, people are willing to listen to extreme ideas that they wouldn't listen to or be likely to listen to if the economy was normal, healthy. People had jobs and money saved and a nice home. In that kind of situation, they're going to listen to more mainstream ideas. But in this kind of situation of major economic and other types of suffering that kind of radiate out from it, people are at their wits' end and trying to understand what's happening to them and why, and so their thinking is much easier, I think, led astray. They get kind of hazy in their thinking, and they're prone then to, I don't mean everybody, but more people are prone to radical, extreme solutions to problems that they would not entertain in more normal times. Which brings us to the rise of the totalitarian twins, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. So there are other totalitarian states that rise during the interwar period, Italy being the other kind of more, the other famous one, but some of the smaller European countries move in that direction as well. But for reasons of time and priority, we're picking these two. There's no doubt that the Nazi German government and the Soviet communist government under Stalin and at first Lenin were the two most important ones here in terms of their impact on history. Most of it, dangerous impact on history. And at one time, until recent decades, it was believed that the Nazis and the Soviets, as we saw on the political spectrum in one of our slides, were seen as polar opposites of each other. And in some ways that's true. Communist countries like the Soviet Union are anti-capitalist. The Nazis, at least on paper weren't anti-capitalist, though we're going to get into that a little bit here. So there certainly were differences between the two. But as it says on the screen, I think the similarities are more illuminating than the differences. And that's what was sort of missing, I think, from the picture in scholarship on these two enormously powerful but destructive regimes, was their similarities. And so we're going to focus on the similarities. We already kind of covered what is totalitarianism in a general sense. Now we'll kind of sort of put some pieces of it together to get back to that whole. One writer at the time, speaking of this type of system, said, "I do not want to be I want to be we." And this is what totalitarian leaders, parties, governments do. They're trying to get you, force you, if necessary, and they have no problem doing it, giving up the I and turning into a collective and ordered around we, being willingly ordered around as we. Right? We're all sort of in this together. Remember that World War I, the way it sort of twisted and distorted people's sort of view of things and view of the world, Enlightenment tradition, and the problems, in the interwar years, even on top of that, caused a lot of people to question liberal democracy. So we've already covered that. But there's sort of more I in liberal democracy than we. So this fits sort of with the we mentality. And we, right, sort of collectively together in a way that subsumes individual goals. So the number one similarity, at least on our list, the cult of the leader. All of these systems practically deify the leader. In the Soviet Union, it became Stalin. In Germany, it was Hitler. Italy, Mussolini, and on and on. And you have to, for this to work, this system to work, you pretty much have to use, if you're the government, do propaganda and present the leader as virtually a godlike figure. And sometimes even use, and they did, sort of religious imagery and religious language to make someone like Hitler look like a messiah coming, sort of to save the people. And when we say cult of the leader, I think that's an appropriate word, because there is a sense in which these type of totalitarian systems brainwash their public to kind of go along, to willingly go along, to actually see the leader as not just okay, wink, wink, wink and a nod. I know I have to say that this guy's a godlike figure, but okay, I'll say it, but underneath I know it's BS. No, you get people to actually drink the Kool-Aid, to actually believe that the leader is all the things being claimed. Now you don't get everyone to do that, but if you get enough, this can work. And these systems did get enough, or they wouldn't have come to power and lasted in power for any time whatsoever. So the cult of the leader, and this also, I think, tells us something else about totalitarian systems, especially in this time and place, in this context, and that is that cult, right, also connotes religion, or something like religion, and there are many scholars now that see this and say it. I agree with them, that what the Nazis and the Soviets presented was, in a sense, a quasi-religion, a substitute for religion, capitalizing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on the fact that more and more Europeans, by the middle of the 20th century, and this trend had been going on for at least a century, were moving towards a more secular outlook. There were fewer and fewer Europeans that really believed in traditional religion any longer. And what may be a partial explanation for these governments becoming popular, totalitarianism being not just tolerated but embraced by this person, that person, the public, is that, and how much they realized what was going on is not clear. Again, could be subconscious, but that individuals who couldn't believe in traditional God any longer still had kind of a need to believe, a need to fit into something sort of larger, right? Belonging to a church, believing in the God, in that church, is a way to connect, sort of with, something bigger, something transcendent, and maybe. And again, I say maybe, but there's been plenty of studies on this. Maybe people need something that pushes them towards the transcendent, or a belief in the transcendent, in a way that comforts them and gives them sort of the will to go on, gives them something to live for, gives them a sense of meaning. And so some see the totalitarian systems here as substitutes for religion in ways that provided meaning for people. However irrational it seems to us today, however crazy it seems to be thinking of the Nazi Party as a substitute for religion, yes, we are kind of saying that. But it shows that things were twisted and strange indeed in the extremely hard times that confronted Europe, especially after the stock market crash, but even before. Although totalitarian systems work hard to try to, persuade people, even brainwash them, sort of to get them to kind of willingly go along, they don't take any chances. There's also always a police state in totalitarian systems. If it's going to be total, you have to try to keep everyone on board, even the reluctant, by intimidating them, by brutalizing them, by frightening them. And so the police state is a common feature in the Soviet Union. You had a number of variations on secret police, which eventually became the KGB, before that the NKVD, and it kind of goes back in time, basically back to Nicholas I and the revolt, of 1825 there, that was put down mercilessly by the Tsar, started sort of a secret police system, and ever since the Russians, Soviets, then Russians again, have been known for this type of activity, doing it well, which isn't necessarily a compliment. Nazi Germany, of course, is famous for being a police state. The Gestapo, the SS, security police, and the tendency of these regimes to crack down on any dissent or any potential dissent, in a sense to terrorize their own population, to keep them in line by, in some ways, random cracking down on people. There were times where people got arrested for no known crime. They didn't know why they got arrested. Nobody, their neighbors didn't know why they got arrested, and they just disappeared and never seen from and never heard from again. There is some evidence that Stalin may have just had people arrested at random, just to intimidate their neighbors and keep everyone gulp. We better not do anything out of line at all. My neighbor seemed like a totally upstanding citizen, and probably was, and got arrested and shot anyway. So, and the police, of course, to make this as terrorizing as possible, when do they come for you? Not at lunchtime. They come at 2 in the morning, and you're asleep in bed, and you hear, and you sit bolt upright in bed, and right there, this could be the end for me, and probably is. Another major feature of the totalitarian systems, both communist and Nazi or fascist, is that there's a state-directed economy, and the state control of civil society, or taking over of civil society and eradicating it, which we already mentioned. But it's traditionally been believed that it was the communists that were anti-capitalists, and that the fascists in Italy, other places, Nazis in Germany, were pro-capitalists. But I don't think that's not accurate. It's much more complicated than that. First off, the Nazi acronym comes from National Socialist Party. So technically speaking, the Nazi Party was called the National Socialist Party. Now, some of that I think was for propaganda purposes, to kind of draw in as many Germans as possible on the Nazis' part. So if they come across as socialists, so we'll get more of the working class in, even if we're not. But there were some socialist-leaning Nazis in the party. The party was never totally uniform in its beliefs, especially in the early years before Hitler became the dictator of Germany. So there was a socialist wing of the Nazi Party from the outset. But I think that you see that the Germans, the Nazis, though they allowed corporations to accrue capital and make fortunes and make a lot of money, they also told them what to do a great deal as well, and directed the economy towards their goals and energies. So they weren't socialist in the sense that they were trying to redistribute income. They weren't taking the companies out of the hands of capitalists and killing the capitalists, but nonetheless the Nazis' goals were so much focused on their concept of racial conflict worldwide, and Germany as the master race having to come out on top of that, that they more or less subsumed all state or all economic institutions to their own needs. There was a strong effort to annihilate the individual. I don't mean physically, though that happens certainly plenty as well, but to get rid of the concept of the individual. Remember, everything is for the state, or the race, or the class, depending on what the movement is using as its sort of focus, its foundation. So the whole, the needs of the whole, the needs of the collective, the needs of the state, the race, the class, subsume the individual and annihilates them. There are no individual goals. Your individual dreams don't matter, and their cold water is poured on them in many different ways, so that you, in a sense, become an automaton doing your role for the state, and being told all the while, and many people even believing it, that if you do this for a certain amount of time, we'll eventually get to a perfect society, and you'll actually be much, much happier for it, as crazy as that sounds. There have been some studies on what type of individual would actually want to annihilate their individuality, willingly go along with subsuming it to everything else. This isn't entirely clear, but there have been authors, scholars that have said, for instance, that people who had once been quite religious and lost their capacity to believe tended to go for this kind of thing. So a type we've already talked about in relation to totalitarianism. Also, one famous writer saying that people that hated themselves were prone to becoming converted Nazis or fascists, because they felt like they were failures in their individual lives, whether they were or not. They felt like it, and so they loved the opportunity to try to forget their failures or perceived failures and to join something larger than life, larger than themselves, and they could sort of ride on the success of that sort of larger thing as being part of it, a way to kind of feel like a success, but not through individual effort and activity, but through collective effort. There's always a search for an enemy in a totalitarian system, and usually an enemy within and an enemy without. So within your own borders and foreign enemies as well, and sometimes more than one. When in Nazi Germany, we know it was communists and Jews, and oftentimes they were thought of as one and the same. And in the Soviet Union, the common enemy was a group called the kulaks. Who were the kulaks? They were the most well-off peasant farmers in the Russian countryside. I don't mean they were super rich, but they were doing better than their neighbor farmers. They had rather substantial farms and worked them hard and were good at it, and had become something in society. They're not upper class by any stretch, but they're kind of like middle class. But they had pretty successful farms. They were absolutely abused by Lenin, Stalin, the Communist Party, and labeled as the enemy. I mean, profusely and openly labeled as enemies of the state. Why? Because, well, the very fact that they've made quite a bit of money on their farms proves that they're greedy. It proves that they, think that they're better than you. It proves that they don't care about you. How do they have all this? How can they live with themselves having this, piece of land that's better or bigger and more productive than yours? So they were singled out, sent to prison camps, gulags, sometimes imprisoned, executed, and were roundly abused. There's always the promise of utopia in totalitarian systems, always. So that if you just hang on, sort of stick with us, if you just believe, you'll eventually reach the promised land with the rest of us. This also, of course, has religious overtones to it, and so we can see the quasi-religious nature of this type of thought process and ideology and value system, because right, you have to suffer for now, sort of work with the sort of the community of believers, sacrifice for that community, and in the end you'll achieve bliss and happiness, heaven, utopia, whatever you want to call it. And this is believed by more people than you might think, because I think it's common to them. Come on, most, I get why everyone went along with the Nazis. They're terrified, but nobody really believed it. Nobody but a handful of psychopaths. That's just not true. A lot of people sort of believe this and fell for this hook, line, and sinker. The promise of utopia. That's why they're involved in the first place. They believe that Hitler is going to deliver on a perfect world, or Stalin is going to deliver on that. However ridiculous that appears to us today, and it indeed does, this was hell on earth. And how was it getting better? When was it going to get better? These promises were often quite vague because there was no real utopia, although some of the leaders themselves believed it, making it easier to sell that way. But you always have to sell utopia. There's a great movie that I recommend to anyone. I may already have to some, called Downfall, which is about Hitler's last weeks of life living in a bunker below Berlin, which is a true story, as the Russians were closing in on Berlin and pummeling it with bombing and artillery fire. Hitler is living relatively safely in this underground bunker made for him, and he's got dozens and dozens of staff, his own secretaries, people that the cleaning, but also his top most trusted military advisors, some political leaders. Some came there to join him willingly, knowing that there was a good chance they might not make it out, because the Russians had basically surrounded the place. They could fly in, could try to fly out, but it was dangerous. And there's a scene in that movie where Albert Speer, the guy who plays him, one of the top advisors to Hitler, his personal architect, and eventually the minister of the economy or munitions, the guy who had to figure out how to rebuild factories and produce enough of this or that to keep Germany in the war. But Speer flies in under danger, but only to say goodbye to Hitler out of sort of respect for him. But he's too smart, too rational to stay there and sacrifice his life, in loyalty to Hitler. And Hitler's not wild about it, but lets it happen. But he goes in to see the wife of Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, as we'll see, was another one of Hitler's most important and trusted political allies. Minister of propaganda, made him an important person. and he brought his family. He and his wife had like 5 or 6 beautiful little children, and he brought the family there and to die with Hitler. And Speer understood that that was what was going on. So there's a scene where he goes in and talks to her. I don't know how much we know that this scene actually happened, though the movie Downfall is based on the diary or the memoirs published of Hitler's young personal secretary in the bunker at the time. I forget her name. So it is based on somebody's actual first-hand account, but they must have taken some liberties with it. Nonetheless, the sentiment here is true to life for Nazi true believers, whether or not the scene actually happened. But Speer tries to implore her, look, you and your husband and your beautiful little children, get on a plane now and get out of here. It's going to be a matter of days or hours. The Russians are going to be here. You're going to die here. And her response, which I think shocks not most Americans, or just they scratch their heads like, what's she talking about? She says, I'd rather die than live in a world without Nazism. Right? I'd rather die than live in a world where there's no Nazis around. What? But this is sort of the true believer in action. Now, we can understand if somebody would say, I'd rather die than live without freedom, or I'd rather die than live without equality. Right? That would actually make sense to us. We might not go that far. Some of us might, some of us may not. But, in actually doing that, but we'd understand it. It wouldn't seem irrational to us. This seems just downright bonkers, but it shows us that even at the bitter end, in this case, of Nazism's life, there are still some true believers that actually think that this is leading towards, utopia, or at least we thought it was, and now that it's not, I don't want to even live any longer, which is what the character playing Frau Goebbels was saying.